Well, thank you, everybody, and welcome back to our course on music inspired by the natural world. I'm going to share my screen here, and there we go. We are in class number 5 of the 6 classes of this course, and so this is the first of the last third of the course. So you might recall that the course is divided into thirds of 2 weeks each. So the first couple of weeks we talked about music inspired by features of the earth, and then we talked about music inspired by the plant kingdom for the last couple of weeks. Now we're going to transfer over to music inspired by animals. And as you might possibly guess, the animals that have been the most inspirational to composers, if my slideshow will work here, and it's not for some reason, so let's do this, are birds. Lots and lots of composers have been inspired by birds. Here we go. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time today on music inspired by birds. Obviously, there's a strong musical connection because birds sing, they have songs, and that's something which many composers have taken as inspiration. And also they're very graceful and beautiful animals, which is part of the inspiration in and of themselves. So we have several excerpts here I want to play you by different composers about music inspired by birds. And some of these composers are new to the course, and so I want to talk about a little bit about the composers as we do that. Probably the most famous and certainly one of my favorite pieces of music inspired by birds is by Otorino Respighi, the great Italian composer of the early 20th century, Gli Uccelli, which simply means the birds, which he composed in 1927. A word about Respighi. Respighi came along in the early 20th century during a time of enormous changes in music, and we've talked about this a little bit before, but in the early part of the 20th century, particularly around 1910 to 1920, there were a lot of composers led by the German composer Arnold Schoenberg, who began composing extremely weird music, if I can use that non-technical term. Music that was very clashing, music that was dissonant. They were composers who rejected the idea of melody, who rejected the idea of harmony. And much of their music sounds like almost random notes thrown together. They would tell you and argue at length that the music was not random, that it had patterns. But the problem was the patterns were so subtle that it was almost impossible for the audience to discern them. And so their music wasn't very popular, at least among audience members. But there were many composers, many professors at music conservatories, many conductors, many music critics who loved the new music. I'm not sure they really loved it in terms of listening to it, but they loved the idea that music was taking new and unusual paths and was maturing away from the very traditional sort of melodic and harmonic music that we found in the 19th century. So a lot of people felt that once you get past, Wagner and Verdi and Saint-Saens and Rimsky-Korsakov and Dvorak and many of the late 19th century composers, that really music just had to take a next step in its evolution. And this was thought to be the next step. Well, that's okay. There was one problem with that, and that is that even though the music of the 20th century, the avant-garde music, was popular theoretically, it really wasn't popular with audiences. Audiences never did like it much. And so many composers whose works were performed a fair amount in those days found that nobody came to the concerts, or those who did come would boo and hiss. And so eventually, and it took a long time, but eventually that music sort of faded away. And in the 1970s and thereafter, a lot of composers, contemporary composers, began turning away from that kind of stuff and going back to melody and harmony. And we heard a little bit of that in some earlier classes. But the point is that the kind of clashing, dissonant music of the first half, let's say, and a little bit more than half of the 20th century became unpopular. Not that it was ever really that popular with audiences in the first place. However, there were some composers, and this brings us to Respighi, who were composing at that time period, who rejected the new style of music composition. They rejected all the clashing, dissonant music. They were believers in melody and harmony, just like their predecessors had been. And so they took their inspiration from Beethoven and Schubert and from Mahler and from Wagner and from Verdi and from Rimsky-Korsakov and Borodin and many of the great classical composers of the 19th century. And while their music may have some tinges of modernism in it, such as some dissonances now and then and that sort of thing, still their music was fairly traditional. It was understandable by people who were familiar with traditional classical music. And so that was what Respighi was. So in some quarters, he was considered a champion who rejected all the nonsensical modernism of the time. In other quarters, he was considered to be a traditionalist who should be ignored, somebody who time had passed him by, and he shouldn't be paid any attention to. And so there was an interesting sort of clash of opinions about composers like Respighi. And another composer is Vaughan Williams, who we're going to hear from him in a few minutes. These two composers were rough contemporaries, as you can see from their dates here. Vaughan Williams, 7 years older, lived a couple of decades later. He had a long compositional career. Respighi, unfortunately, died a little bit too early. But still, these two composers do have this in common, and that is that they were traditionalists in an age when traditionalists were not very well respected, at least by some. But in time, their music has become more and more popular. Respighi is one of my favorite composers, and I realize that I can be accused of saying that about almost every composer we're featuring in this course, but he wrote some beautiful things. His hometown was Rome, and he's most famous for a trilogy of works about Rome: The Pines of Rome, The Fountains of Rome, and Roman Festivals. These works go back in Roman history, and they describe things that would have happened during the history of Rome in musical terms, and all three of them are just magnificent. He also wrote a number of operas. He wrote a lot of tone poems, and he wrote this magnificent work sort of later in his career called The Birds. By the way, Respighi was the professor of composition at the Conservatorio di Santa Cecilia, which was then and is today one of the leading music conservatories in Italy, in fact, in the world. And so he produced a number of students who went on to become famous composers as well. But let's listen to this. Now, Respighi had a couple of interests here. First of all, he was inspired by the birds. And of course, that's the reason for this. He loved to sit in the piazzas of Rome and listen to the sounds, and he loved the birds who would visit the piazzas. And so the prelude to the birds has many different birds cackling away, and you can kind of hear their strutting about, which you'll hear in the music. And then he has other movements which depict certain birds, and so we'll hear just three of those. But he had another interest, which he interestingly combined here, and that is that he loved to go back and study the music of some ancient Baroque composers. And the music of these movements of the birds, which we're going to be listening to, not only depicts birds, but it's also based upon some piano sonatas written by Baroque composers who are largely forgotten today. These three are Pasquini, Galop, and Rameau, the last two French composers, of course, Pasquini, Italian. And so you both hear the birds, and if you listen really carefully, you can kind of hear some almost Baroque sounding music with modern inflection. Okay, well, I've talked enough. Let's listen to these four movements from Ilyich. Things are just not cooperating today, I'm sorry. So I don't know about you, but listening to that music, and I can always picture myself in a little piazza in Rome, maybe feeding crumbs of bread to the birds as they're strutting about. And just a wonderful evocation, I think, of birds by Ottorino Respighi, of whose music we should hear much more, in my opinion. Well, so let's turn to Ralph Vaughan Williams. Looks like Ralph Vaughan Williams, but pronounced Rafe in the English manner, who was one of the great symphonic composers of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. Like Respighi, as I mentioned earlier, he rejected the newer trends in music and composed music in a much more harmonious sort of manner. He is more normally characterized by music historians as being one of the great nationalistic composers of the late 19th and early 20th century. And just to briefly review that, the 19th century was the century of nationalism. in Europe in the 1800s and earlier in 1800, the year 1800, very few of the nations that we would recognize today as nations of Europe even existed. There was no Italy, there was no Germany, there was no Poland, there was no Austria, there was no many of the countries that we recognize today didn't even exist. It was by pulling together fiefdoms and baronies and that sort of thing that the politicians began to put together and stitch together the nation states, which became the nations of Europe. So there's a great sweep of nationalism in the 19th century of Europe as people politically began to think of themselves as being citizens of nations. And part of that was an influence on composers who began to say that, well, there's nationalistic music, that music is part of what stitches us together and creates the German state or the Italian state, for example. So there were composers who would go out and to mostly small towns and peasant communities and so forth, and listen to the singing and listen to the playing and listen to the music, and then try to preserve these folk tunes, if you will, and use them in their own compositions. And there's a whole series of composers who are considered to be nationalist composers. I mean, one of the greatest was Smetana from Bohemia, and we heard some of his work earlier in this class, in this course. Well, here's another one. Vaughan Williams was very much attuned to English folk music, and so he used a lot of English folk music in his compositions. But his compositions structurally are very much in the traditional sense of Beethoven and Schubert and Tchaikovsky symphonies. He wrote this wonderful work, which isn't a symphony, but it's a tone poem, which basically means a piece of music depicting something that's not as long as a symphony and in one movement, called The Lark Ascending, and it's about a lark, a bird, and he is using the violin solo to portray the bird. And it's just a wonderful example, I think, of early 20th century orchestral, traditional sounding, but nonetheless somewhat modernistic composition by Vaughan Williams, one of the great orchestral and symphonic composers of the late 19th, early 20th century. So The Lark Ascending by an English composer. just a little bit of this wonderful piece of music. It lasts about 20 minutes, but I certainly recommend it to you. Vaughan Williams, by the way, had a long and productive career. He was still composing music at the age of 86. And since he started when he was a teenager or just out of his teens, why, he had an almost 70-year compositional career. So very few composers over history have had a career that long. So let's continue with our theme of birds. We talked last week about the English composer Frederick Delius. Although he studied in France and was transplanted to Florida, he was the guy, remember, who was sent there by his dad to run the family orange groves. And he was a terrible business manager, and so the orange groves went bankrupt. But he learned a lot about music and was inspired by Florida to write lots of wonderful pieces of music. Well, here's one he wrote. On hearing the first cuckoo of spring, again, an underperformed composer in my view, Frederick Delius. Beautiful music by Frederick Delius. You know, the nice thing about Delius's music is that if you like one piece, you're going to like everything. But it's all very much in a similar style, very much influenced by the French Impressionists, but I think quite gorgeous. If you're still old-fashioned like me and you collect compact discs, there's a two-set compact disc set of Delius's music that really contains almost all the music he wrote. He didn't write all that much, and it's really an indispensable part of anybody's collection. I wish that the orchestra conductors would program more of Delius's music these days. Maybe it'll come back in fashion someday. Well, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov was a late 19th, very early 20th century Russian composer. And I don't think we've talked about him previously in this class, and so let's do that for just a bit. Rimsky-Korsakov was a symphonic composer who came along in the latter part of the 19th century in Russia, and was, like some of the other Russian composers, mostly self-trained. There was one conservatory of music in Russia in Moscow, and it was run by a very well-known professor and dean by the name of Anton Rubinstein. But Rubinstein was a very, very traditional, old-fashioned type of guy. And a lot of the Russian composers sort of eschewed the idea of studying under him. The only really great Russian composer who did was Tchaikovsky. And Rubinstein found Tchaikovsky's music altogether too adventurous, which is ironic because today we consider Tchaikovsky's music pretty traditional. So Rimsky-Korsakov, along with several other Russian composers, basically rejected the idea of an academic study of music and instead just sort of went with their instincts, and more through working with each other and studying with each other and criticizing each other's music. They sort of grew a music school of their own. And this school was called the Mighty Five. There were 5 Russian composers who were famous for this, for doing this in the late 19th century. One was Mussorgsky, who became a very famous composer. The other, Rimsky-Korsakov, who also did. The other 3, Balakirev, Chu, and I'm not remembering right now the name of the 5th one, were not nearly as well known. But certainly 2 of the 5 became well known, and Rimsky-Korsakov was one of those. Kind of a funny story of Rimsky-Korsakov. When Rubinstein died, Rimsky-Korsakov was asked to take over the professorship at the Moscow Conservatory of Music and Composition. He was only in his 20s, I think he was 29, but already a very well-known composer. And he decided he would do that, except he struggled with it because he really didn't know much about music theory. He didn't really know much about sonatas and sonatinas and fugues and various kinds of music compositions. And so he really had to study up. And so it was almost like a comedy. He took on the classes and he was madly studying at night on what he was going to lecture the classes on the next morning. But he did learn enough to be able to become a very well-known professor at the conservatory and educated many a Russian composer, including Shostakovich and Prokofiev and Stravinsky of the next generation, who became wonderful Russian composers. So Rimsky-Korsakov was really the father of Russian music in a way of the early 20th century. He was a master orchestrator. He was wonderful at being able to balance the different kinds of tones, sounds of orchestral instruments, do an orchestral palette, which was very attractive. And he eventually ended up writing a treatise on orchestration, which was, until recently, the basic treatise on orchestration that was used in music schools all around the world. So, but he himself wrote lots of wonderful music. We're going to focus here on an opera called The Golden Cockerel, about a bird. This is really just an orchestral suite, so you won't hear any singing in this piece of music, but to give you a flavor of the music of Rimsky-Korsakov and his opera inspired by a bird. Just a little bit of Rimsky-Korsakov's opera, The Golden Cockerel. Um, well, let's now go back to Richard Wagner. Wagner, an old friend now. We know him well by this point. He's been featured in most of the classes in our course, and I want to return to the opera that I consider to be the central opera of his great 4-opera series called The Ring Cycle, about Siegfried. Siegfried, again, is the great hero of this series of operatic plots. And the opera called Siegfried is based upon his younger life. He's been raised in the forest by an old dwarf and hidden from the rest of the world in order to protect him. But he's soon going to mature, and he's going to forge the Midas sword, which will kill the terrible dragon, who is the villain of the piece. So this is kind of a fairy tale piece. But there's a section during Wagner's opera Siegfried where the boy Siegfried is in the forest, and he has a hunting horn with him, and he is wandering around sort of learning what he can from the animals of the forest, and he hears the bird. And so eventually he listens to the bird song, and then he joins in with his horn. He tries to imitate the bird song with his hunting horn. And then he and the bird have kind of a little duet. So it's one of the very few human-animal duets of which I'm aware in opera, but a beautiful excerpt from the opera Siegfried by Richard Wagner. Again, an entirely orchestral excerpt. You're not going to hear any singing. Just a little bit of the bird song that you hear from Richard Wagner's opera Siegfried. Well, next I want to go to another great opera composer, Gioacchino Rossini. We have talked a little bit about Rossini before the great dominating Italian opera composer of the early part of the 19th century and one of the kings of so-called bel canto opera, the term that simply means beautiful singing, and it's a really style of operatic composition which led to many great works that we still consider to be classics of the repertoire today. Rossini wrote both dramatic and comic operas, probably better remembered today for his comic operas, although certainly some of his dramas still hold the stage as well. One of the operas he wrote was called La Gazza Ladra, which means the Thieving Magpie. And it's a comic opera, largely comic opera, although it does have some dramatic incidents in it, which I've never seen. In all of my years of opera going, I've never seen a production of La Gazza Ladra. I would love to see it. It's got lots of beautiful music. I've got a recording of it. And it's just one of those lost masterpieces that seems to have gotten overshadowed by other things. But the story of the Thieving Magpie is a very interesting one. So the story is that there's a young servant girl in a household who's very well regarded by the household. She has fallen in love with the young master of the house, and he with her. And the two of them wish to get married, except the matron of the house is very much opposed to the marriage because she thinks that the servant girl is a thief. She's noticed that some of her silverware has been disappearing from the table. Knives and forks and things just disappear. She's convinced that this servant girl is stealing the goods. And so she objects to the marriage. Not only that, but she demands that the girl be prosecuted for theft. And so there's a trial scene in the opera in which the girl is prosecuted for theft. And even though they can't find the items that she's stolen, there's really no other explanation anybody can think of for how the items could have disappeared, because nobody else has really had access to them. And so she's convicted for theft. And in the final scene of the opera, she's being taken to the gallows. The gallows, they apparently treated thievery pretty seriously in those days. So she's being led to her execution when her boyfriend, the young master of the house, obviously wishing to rescue her from this situation, does some searching around and finds the truth. And the truth is that there's a bird, a magpie, who has been coming in through the window and stealing the silverware and depositing it in a cavity in one of the trees, because the young man has discovered the cavity in the tree, and there is all the silverware that has been missing. And so they set up a spying expedition to see, and sure enough, they see the magpie fly in the window and pluck a fork off the table and fly back out. So now the solution has been found. We know what has been the cause of the thefts. It isn't the girl after all. The mother withdraws her objections, and the two of them get married happily ever after at the end of the opera. So it's the most amusing plot, except for the part about the gallows, which is pretty serious until she gets rescued from that. This is just a bit from the overture of The Thieving Magpie by Rossini. So see if you can detect the magpie here. I meant to mention before we go on that this overture is also a great example of the Rossini crescendo. So a crescendo in music is where you start very softly and it gets louder and louder and louder and louder until it reaches a climax. Rossini was the master of the crescendo. Almost all of his overtures and many of the other pieces of music in his operas have crescendos in them. As a matter of fact, he was jokingly referred to as Signor Crescendo. crescendo, but he certainly perfected it. So the overture from his opera about a bird, The Thieving Magpie. So let's go on now and talk about swans in addition to birds. Well, first of all, we'll stick with birds for a second. Antonio Vivaldi, the great composer of violin and other concertos, whom we've talked about several times before in this course, wrote a concerto called Summer, one of his great concertos on the four seasons. And we're going to listen to an excerpt here where he depicts the birds of summertime. The cuckoo, which, as you've found out now, since this is our third excerpt involving cuckoos, is a favorite of composers. And the turtle dove and the goldfinch. So I don't know enough about bird songs to really identify these three, but if any of you can, supposedly they're all right here. Just a little bit from Vivaldi's The Summer with the bird songs. So let's turn now to swans, because swans are very popular among composers. I first want to perform for you, or listen for you, play for you, the Swan from Carnival of the Animals by Camille Saint-Saens. Carnival of the Animals is undoubtedly the musical work which is the most famous for depicting animals in music, and we're going to hear a lot more from Carnival of the Animals next week when we talk about animals other than birds. But probably the most famous excerpt from Carnival of the Animals is about the swan. Camille Saint-Saens was a wonderful French composer of the late 19th century, early 20th century, very traditional composer. He was one of those incredible child prodigies like we've heard stories of before. He was like Mozart and Mendelssohn in that he was a proficient keyboard artist at the age of 5 and began composing at the age of 7. And wrote symphonies at the age of 11, that sort of thing. He was just an amazing prodigy, and one of the real giants of his age. Known mostly for very serious music, very large-scale music. Probably his two best-known compositions are the opera Samson and Delilah, based upon a biblical story, and his wonderful organ symphony, which is a symphony with an organ as a soloist in the symphony. By the way, there's a wonderful recording of the organ symphony done at the Kaufman Center by the Kansas City Symphony and our local outstanding organist, Jan Cravel. But anyway, he also wrote, in addition to those sorts of things, lots of other, he wrote symphonies, he wrote many other kinds of orchestral compositions, ballets, as all French composers did. And then really as a joke, arising out of the discussions with some of his friends, he wrote this series of pieces of music which are really sort of intended for children about depicting animals in music. He never took it seriously. It was never published. It was never performed during his lifetime. But afterwards was published and has become one of his most popular pieces of music. I'm sure a fact which would astonish him if he were alive today. And the most famous excerpt is The Swan, a great cello solo. One of the most famous pieces of music ever written. I'm sure you've all heard this many times. Sometimes choreographed as a ballet, and you can certainly see it that way. But you can just see the swan sailing along the lake when you hear this music. Gorgeous little snippet of music from Camille Saint-Saens. As I said, we're going to hear much more from Carnival of the Animals next week when we get into other animals, getting past birds and swans. But sticking with swans for the rest of today's session, of course, we can't go any longer without playing an excerpt from Swan Lake, the great ballet by Piotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. So Tchaikovsky, again, to return to the theme of Russian composers for a minute, the great, giant Russian composer of the 19th century. Wrote 6 marvelous symphonies, 3 or 4 sensational ballets, many, many other compositions in almost every form you can think of. His music just really towers above all the other Russian composers. So earlier in the century, you had some early Russian composers. Later in the century, you had the Mighty Five that we talked about when we talked about Rimsky-Korsakov, but certainly Tchaikovsky towers above all of the others in terms of the popularity of his music. So we played an excerpt from Swan Lake earlier in this course. You might recall when we were talking about lakes all the way back in class number 1, I think it was. But we have to return now because we're going to talk about the swans on the lake. So those of you who've seen this ballet, it was done last year by the Kansas City Ballet. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece of dancing as well as glorious music. The swans, who are actually young ladies who have been turned into swans by an evil villain, are sailing on the lake. And it's really an enchanting scene to see on the ballet stage as the young ladies are all dressed in white and they have their hands covered with white gloves arching over their heads to sort of imitate the arching of the necks of the swans. It can be very brilliant when choreographed properly and really an attractive ballet on stage. But here, let's listen to the music. So this is the famous Dance of the Swans from Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. Just a little bit of the ballet Swan Lake by Tchaikovsky. Well, finally, let's wrap up our discussion about swans with the Swan of Tuonela, I should say, by Jan Sibelius. I don't think we've encountered Jan Sibelius before this course, so let's talk a little bit about Sibelius. Sibelius was the great composer of Finland. He's the one who wrote Finlandia, the famous national anthem of Finland, but he wrote many, many other things as well, lots of symphonies, many different kinds of tone poems. One of his really great master works is a series of works, musical works, based upon the Lemminkainen legends. And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. If anybody is better at Finnish than I am, well, you can correct. my pronunciation, but the Lemminkainen legends are the epic poems of Finnish history, or at least Finnish legend, that go back to stories that originated in the 800s and 900s. And it's the story of a great prince who was trying to rescue some people who are in oppressive situations, and he has many adventures, and it's a great epic journey, like many epics are. Think of, for example, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and that sort of thing. It's that sort of legend which the Lemminkainen legends are about. And during part of that legend, why there's a lake in Finland called Tuonela, and there's a swan sailing on the lake, and this is the section of the musical realization of these epic poems that we're going to play here in a minute. When I first encountered this music years ago, I didn't know anything about the Lemminkainen legends. I was just listening to the music, and I thought it was one of the most beautiful pieces of music I'd ever heard. And as a matter of fact, I made a point of listening to it at least once a day. And I did that for about a year. And then finally, I began to turn to other things. But I still love to go back and listen to it. I just think it's one of the most gorgeous pieces of music ever written, and I'd never even heard of it until I just happened to encounter it on a CD of music of highlights of Sibelius. It wasn't until fairly recently, in the last couple of years, that I went back and did some research into the Lemminkainen legends and found out, to my horror, that actually the swan is an evil swan, that there is a dastardly villain who has impersonated himself as a swan and who is sailing in the lake of Tuonela. And so this is actually a depiction of the bad guy. Who would have thought from listening to the music that that's what it was about? But Sibelius, like other composers enchanted by the grace and beauty of swans, has written, I think, one of the great pieces of short music. And so let's listen to Swan of Tuonela from the Lemminkainen legends, Johann Sibelius. Well, it goes on. It's about a 12 or 13-minute piece of music, but certainly I encourage you to explore it on your own. So at this point, Lori, I'm going to go ahead and stop the share, and we can hopefully have some comments, questions about the music that we've heard so far.
Just a reminder, you can unmute yourself by either the icon down in the bottom left hand of your screen, or you can find your picture and there'll be a blue box that says unmute as you roll over your own picture, and you can click that, or you can send me a text message and I will unmute you.
Were there any pieces of music there that were unfamiliar to people? Did you listen to something new for the first time?
Well, I had never heard of a couple of these composers, Respighi and this Vaughan Williams.
Right.
And so I want to look into them more. I enjoyed them.
Good. I'm glad you did.
Donna, on one of your slides, you had up at the top MUSK, which I assume is music, but and I assume that that's not a typo. Is there some background for that?
I honestly don't know. Hold on a second. I'll share the screen again and see if we can find that.
Go back one slide.
I'm trying to. As always, for some reason, when you punch the button, it doesn't work. So let's try this.
Okay.
Hold on.
Let it go.
No, I want to find out because I honestly.
There.
On this slide, MUSK, inspired by the natural world.
Oh, no, sorry. That's just, I'll fix that. That's supposed to say music. I don't know where that came
You were
from.
going to tell me that that was Russian or something.
And no, I don't know how that crept in there. I'll fix that for the next time. Yeah, you're right. Musk. No, so far as I know, it's not. Musk has nothing to do with our course. Thanks.
It's Judy. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm in Never Never Land. I only have just a little postage stamps, but that's good. You can hear me. I did 2 comments. When we started with probably the birds, I had memories of Peter and the Wolf and how we connected instruments to animals.
Yeah.
And it just, I love that connections. And of course, it's an early childhood connection.
Sure.
And I also wanted to point out as we go on through this course and the experiences I'm having, I know I can listen to music. I listen to it all the time at home on CDs or, other devices. But it's been really nice in this particular venue because it's a little bit like going to the symphony. And then I'm listening to it with other people. And that seems to make a difference. Who knew? And,
it may be a while before we get back to the symphony.
It may be a while. So it's really nice to listen to it with other people, and probably even after we've all shared music like we do at the symphony at intermission or afterwards to talk about it. So thank you so much for doing this. And we're so sorry that next week's going to be your last week, but we know you'll be back.
Well, I've got other courses if you aren't too tired of me.
I know. Stay in touch. We'll be in touch. Somebody else.
To build on what Judy's said, I guess I'd like to share with my classmates that thanks to Don and his repertoire of classes and his willingness to bring that to Spark and work with Lori this summer, we're having a very good series of classes. And I think we owe a great big thank you to Don and to Lori for making all of this happen. So
yeah,
both personally and as, I guess, a board member, why, thank you both.
We're very fortunate to have Lori who can educate us all on Zoom.
All I do is the technical part. Don gets all the credit for it being fabulous because he's giving us content.
Barbara?
Don, can you let us know what your other courses are so that we could try to get in on those as well?
Oh, I've given Judy a list of my repertoire. I teach several versions of courses called The Great Composers, where I take a composer and spend about a half hour on that composer biography and music and so forth, that composer. So I've got some of those. I've taught a course previously for Spark on history of the world as seen through the eyes of the great composers, which is about another aspect of composers being inspired by things, in that case, inspired by works of history. And I've got, well, the one course that I would love to teach, although I haven't put it together yet, is a course on women composers, because I'm a particular fan of lots of
Right.
underperformed and
Interesting.
appreciated women composers. And so if anybody's interested in that, why, that's one I would like to put together and teach.
Yeah, if I can interrupt again, this is a great venue, and there's 20, 25 of you. So maybe next week I'll Don and I'll come up with a list of possibilities, because we'll sign them up for fall for sure, and it would be nice to hear your feedback on what's interesting. That's a nice opportunity. Okay. Thanks, Barbara.
Back to normal life.
Hopefully.
We enjoy the Swan Lake, I think, probably the best of them.
Tchaikovsky wrote some wonderful ballet
For
music.
yourself, I enjoyed some of the others.
Okay. Carnival of the Animals is another.
Yeah.
Lots of
Yeah.
possibilities.
We're gonna hear a lot more from that next week, where we talk about, we go beyond birds, we mature beyond birds next week, and we're going to talk about things like elephants. And we will hear much more from Carnival of the Animals next week.
And I think maybe the birds around our house must have been hearing this, because we're hearing a lot more birds chirping outside than we normally do.
That's great. That's great.
Anybody else?
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us for this class session, and we'll finish up the course next week. Hard to believe that the 6 weeks are going by so quickly, but so they are. So we'll have our final class section a week from today.
Don, I want to you. This is Louise. I really appreciate. I'm learning so much about the individual composers like Sibelius, and I'd love to know more about the epic poetry that he was making this beautiful Swan into, this awful character. But the way you can relate all that, the poetry and to the writers, and it would be interesting to hear about how history has affected them too when they write. So thank you for your well-rounded presentation. So wonderful.
Thank you. I think the more you know about the background, sometimes the more you appreciate the music you're hearing. So thank you,
Absolutely.
Louise, for that
Yeah.
great comment.
Thank you
so much.
Okay. Lori, thank you for helping us out.
Of course. And thank you guys for joining us. We will get this up to YouTube as quickly as they will allow us to, and it'll be there for you to watch. Thank you.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.